Hello everybody, June here. Welcome back to episode number 6 and penultimate in the vintage cape coat making series. In this video, I am going to do the hem of the cape and the coat, as well as add the lining. I'm also going to sneak in there the making of the belt loops because I want the belt that goes with the coat, the wrap belts, whatever, to not get lost, to stay with the coat, to always cinch at the same place. So I'm going to put 2 belt loops, one on each side, and I said that in the very first video in this series. This is not part of the pattern, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And I haven't decided whether I'm going to do thread loops or a fabric belt loop from this same fabric. I polled my Instagram sewing friends, and they all, well, the majority of them seem to think that fabric was the way to go, and that's how I'm leaning, but I will get to that when I get to that. In the last video, I did most of the top stitching for the edges of the coat where the facing and the body meet, except for, you can't really see very well here, but till about there or so. Because to do the coat, I have to open the bottom and fold it up and then open it so that it looks something like this. But before I get to the folding and the pressing, I want to show you something that I did that is not in the pattern instructions. And let's see if I can work with this massive amount of fabric here. But the cape, let's start with the cape because it's the most obvious. The cape has no lining at all, and I wanted to make sure that when I fold the hem, so the fold of the hem at the bottom doesn't get worn out with time. And one way to do that is to add some interfacing to where the fold is going to happen. So that is what you see here. Before I added the interfacing, I marked my hem inside on the wrong side with chalk, and then I cut strips on the regular cross grain of interfacing. It's pretty lightweight interfacing. It's not the same that I used for the facing, but it's enough to give it some strength. And I pressed that all around the inside, so the wrong side of the cape. And then I also did it, if I can find it here, on the wrong side of the back of the coat. If you can see that there, because it is not interlined. So I didn't do it on the front. The fronts are interlined, and so they already have some strength. Another thing that I did before I started recording, because nobody wants to see me hand sew anything for an eternity, was thread mark, well, first chalk mark and then thread mark my hem. If you can see that there, let's see. So that when I go press it, I know exactly where my hem is supposed to be. And also, because my interlining, for whatever reason, didn't go all the way down to the edge of the front of the cape, I just did a very quick catch stitch slash cross stitch, herringbone stitch, to secure the interlining to what is going to be the inside of the hem, so that it doesn't float loose in the air and get all crumpled and stuff. So the next step is to press the hem, and the hems, both for the cape and for the coat, are done before the lining, because this lining is not bagged. The lining is put in a different way that you might be familiar with, because it is a vintage technique, a vintage construction technique, and the lining is sewn by hand. So we'll get to that later in the video. But right now I am going to press the hem up, and I'm not going to do a video of that because nobody wants to see me pressing stuff for an eternity either. And after I am done pressing the hem, I am going to sew my velvet ribbon to the cape part. So here, I'm going to sew the velvet ribbon to the right side so that ultimately it looks just like this. And then I will do the hem by sewing, or secure the hem by sewing the ribbon to my wool. And that'll be it for the hem, and after that we'll move to the lining. That was close. This is how much ribbon I had at the end. I was getting a little concerned, but the ribbon did its job, and this is just as well, because otherwise it would have just gone to waste. So I think I measured right. Now that the ribbon is attached to my hem, before I go any further, I want to take care of the belt loops, and here's one. So what I've done is I cut 2 pieces of fabric 3.5 inches long by 1 inch wide, and then I folded it. So you fold it in such a way that the edges meet at the center, and press it, and then whip stitch it by hand, and you end up with something that looks like this. And then it's just a matter of folding in the ends, and then of course this will be top stitched onto the cape coat itself. But it's super easy to make. I don't bother doing the right sides together, seam, and then turn, because first it gets really bulky with all those seams in there, and second, I absolutely despise turning loops because I can never get them right. So I think this is the best way to go, especially if you have thick fabric like I do. I mean, it's not thick, but it's thick enough. And so I will stitch this to the coat after I make the other one, and that should do it. I did measure how long I needed the belt loop to be so that it fits the belt, and this should do it if I'm not wrong. And here is the belt loop sort of pinned to the jacket. I've pinned it 2.5, well, the center of the belt loop is about 2.5 inches under the dart. And this is going to be very interesting. I think I'm going to have to baste it before I put it to the machine. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to get it through. But this is more or less what it will look like. I tested it with a belt loop that I made from the really thick wool that I started making this cape coat with, the really light blue wool from the first video, and that is pretty thick and it fits through okay. So it should be fine for this wool, which is a lot lighter, so the belt will also be a little lighter. All right, so the belt loops are sewn in properly. If I can find it here, they're both sewn in. Now I am going to go ahead and spend a few hours, because I'm very slow at hand sewing. I think I say this every single time. I'm going to spend a few hours doing the hem, and then it's a matter of attaching the lining, and I will show you the lining more in detail, because it's a different technique from modern ones. But for the hem, it's just pretty standard stuff. This is quite a bit bigger than, so it's not quite a circle, but there is more here than the body of the cape, so I'm going to have to steam it into shape a little bit, and it's not as bad in the actual coat part, so that should be easier. But yes, hemming this is going to be a pig, but it has to be done. I will catch up with you once I've done that. I've hemmed the cape and I've hemmed the coat. You can't see it here, obviously, because it doesn't go that far below. But before I move on to attaching the lining, I want to give this collar a good press. Now, it's laying pretty nicely here, but I want to make sure that it kind of stays that way. So what I'm gonna do is, I have my pins here. I'm going to pin some of this in place here just for now, so that it doesn't move. There we go. I'm gonna pin some of it in place, and I'm looking at my monitor here so that I can see. Make sure that everything is even. And then I'm gonna take it to the ironing board, and I am going to press it, actually more steam than press. I don't wanna put the iron directly to it, because I don't want there to be a sharp edge here. I do want it to be slightly rolled, but I want it to stay that way once I take it off. And the color in the back is the hardest part because I can't do it by myself. If only I had a helper. And as if by magic, I have a helper whose head you can't see because he's about 11 feet taller than me. So he's spinning in the back to make sure that the collar stays folded the right way. And maybe I can do it here myself. Maybe from the other side. But the idea is to keep the collar in the shape that it lays on your body, because that is how it's going to be whether you press it or not. So you might as well press it to make it look nice. So yes, I'm gonna take it off, I'm gonna press it, and then I'm going to get on with the lining, which will be the second to last thing, because after the lining, which side do I show you? After the lining, I have to bind the armhole here, which is also done with lining fabric, but we'll get to that when we get to that. And pressing a collar of these proportions, of course, is easier said than done. Here I've done the best I can to sort of pin it to my ham, and then slowly, very slowly, going around, just sort of steaming. Take that pin out. I am barely touching the fabric with the iron. What I'm trying to do really is steam the fabric and then use my hands to sort of mold it into shape. And if I was very disciplined, I would then use like long running stitches to hold the lapel down, or even the stitches that look like pad stitching but they're only temporary, to hold the lapel down so that it doesn't keep flapping open as you're working. But I'm not going to do that because I am lazy. But now here you can see that for the most part there is still some shape, even though I've taken the pins off. And of course here this is seam, so there is tons of fabric in there that need far more massaging to stay in shape than the other ones. And also, if you're not careful about where you steam and how you steam, you probably will end up with the marks of the pins in the fabric. So once you take the pins out, make sure you do a little bit of steaming where the pins used to be, like here for example, so that you don't have these holes that you can see. So here you can see the marks for the pin. So steam a little bit, rub it. Now the marks are gone. Here, light but effective crease. Now to the lining. So now I am really ready to put in the lining, and I have marked the seam allowances all around the facings and the hem of the coat, just to make sure that when I'm folding the lining that I know exactly where to put it. And along the same lines, I have well, first what I did was I stitched a 5/8 of an inch away from the edge on the lining, so that when I went to press the seam allowance to the wrong side of the lining, I knew exactly where to put it. And this is the part that can get a little bit tricky because there is so much fabric. But stick with me, because even though this is the first time that I do this technique, I have seen coats, actually true vintage coats that are lined this way, and they really hang differently. The lining is more fluid and everything moves better than the modern technique of bagging a lining. So the first thing that you have to do is line up all of your bits and pieces, and this is going to be difficult to show as well because I don't have enough room for everything. But you're going to put the lining, or I'm going to put the lining and the coat wrong side to wrong side. So here it is, and I'm going to match first the center backs and the seams, just to make sure that everything is neat and tidy. So this is the shoulder seam for the lining, which I wish you could see here, but I am lining up to the, so I'm folding the seam allowance of the facing to the inside, and then I'm lining the seam line to the marked seam allowance for the coat. And I'm just going to pin that here. And I'm gonna do the same thing to the other one. And because I've already pressed the seam allowances on my lining to the wrong side, it makes everything so much easier. Then the center back. And here, I don't know if you can see, there's a little pleat here. The pattern for the lining was not separate. It was the same pattern as the pattern for the front of the cape, well, for the front of the coat. It just had you cut the center front in different places. And the back of the coat is cut in two pieces and then sewn with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. For the lining, I cut it on the fold, and then to make sure that the neckline in the back, so the facing in the back, was the same length as what is attached to the coat, I stitched about 1.5 inches down, folding it right sides together, just to create a pleat there. That also helps your lining be a little more fluid, because your lining is slightly bigger than your coat, as it should be. So that's not something that's in the pattern, but it's something that I did anyway. And then I did the same thing at the hem end, so that everything, it's nice and it fits the way that it's supposed to fit. And the neckline in the back is always difficult because it is convex and you're trying to pin it all concave. But it is doable. This is right now is just to anchor it, because before I actually stitched the lining to the coat all the way around, I have to secure the side seams of both the coat and the lining to each other, so that they don't wiggle around. So, but for the neckline, for the lining and the facing in the back, if you put your hand underneath, you sort of create a shape where they will come together. And I see here they're actually coming together perfectly. And the fact that I already pressed and marked things is so much easier. So there we go. For the side seams, what the pattern tells you to do, and it is the way that I'm going to do it, is to find, so this is the lining as it would go on the coat, pull it back and match the side seams of your coat to the side seams of the lining. And because I did French seams, I'm going to make sure that I line the seam line, not the edges, because they will be different. So it says to start about 3 inches or so below. And so I'm matching my darts here. And actually not going to be perfect, but line it up about 3 inches below. And actually I'm gonna go with the dart, and then start pinning the lining to the coat and stitch them together for halfway down the side seams, more or less. And again, what that does is keep your lining and your coat together so that they don't shift in weird ways, and then you end up with your lining on one side of your body and then the coat shifted to the other side of your body. So I'm gonna take it to about halfway down the pocket. I finished sewing both side seams with the very long running stitches. It's all very uneven. It doesn't really matter, nobody's ever gonna see it. So now I'm going to fold this back to where they belong, and I'm going to go around the entire coat, so the facings, and start pinning. But it has to be done from the center back to the hem, so that, because there'll always be some excess that hangs down to the hem that then has to be worked in, but to make sure that everything matches and that things don't bunch up at the center back, that's just the way that it's gotta be done. So again, for the part of the facing that is difficult to work with, for the part of the facing that has shape, if you just put your hand underneath and sort of try to finagle things here a little bit, you should be able to just get it all in there. Let me see. There we go. There we go. So just go all around, pinning and pinning, and when you get to the end, stop about 5 inches above, and then that'll be that'll give you enough room to let the lining hang down and then be folded up into the hem without too much trouble. It's gonna take a while. Another advantage of sewing the lining this way versus bagging the lining, which is what we normally would do now, is that changing the lining out on a coat that has been lined this way, it's so much easier than on a bagged lining, because literally you just remove the hand stitches and it's done. We're almost to the hemline here, and I'm going to measure, but I do think that this is actually perfect. 5 inches. So the head of the pin is 5 inches from the seam and from the hemline, and as you can see here, let me see if I can move all of this, the lining is much longer than the hemline. So then what I'm going to do is when I start before I get to that, what's going to happen is I'm going to do the stitching, but I just want to show you here what happens with the hem before I get to that point. So what happens is the hem gets folded, everything gets pushed down, and then again it's stitched on there with all of the excess tucked up, and you may end up with a wider hem allowance, if you will, on the lining, just so that there is a bit of an overhang, but not further than the coat hem, but further than the initial marking there. And that's fine. That doesn't make any sense now, but it will make sense when I get to that point. So I'm gonna pin the other side, and then I'm going to come back for the stitching. I've pinned the lining within an inch of its life. Now it's time to start the sewing, and I'm using thread that matches the lining. For no reason that's the one that was right next to me. It should be somewhat invisible. And here I'm using something called Thread Haven, which is kind of like wax, but unlike beeswax, you don't have to press it. You don't have to iron the thread after you wax it, which you do with beeswax, otherwise it's very rough. And this is just to make it easier to stitch, to make sure that things don't tangle, don't knot. And another tip, if you when you're doing hand sewing, you should thread the needle with the end of the spool of thread that comes off first. So for example, here's my thread. This is the end that comes off first. So unroll it, and this bit here is the one that you should put through your needle to avoid tangling and adding extra twists in the thread, which is what makes tangling. And I am absolutely going to knot this, even though tailors don't knot. And I'm going to do a whip stitch this time for real, but invisible. Now, I like to do the stitching from right to left. Some people do it the other way around. And what the pattern says is that rather than stitch on the actual seam line, to very, very slightly roll the fabric back a little bit and stitch there so that it is invisible. So I'm going to do this here. And even though I did a knot on the thread, I will do a couple of back stitches to secure it to the fabric. And with so much fabric to move around, this is going to be very interesting. But let's see what can be done. So ever so slightly move it back and try to catch a little bit of the wool, a little bit of the lining, pretty much all the way around. I'm done doing all the stitching around to about 5 inches away from the edge here. And now it's time to do the hem. And I did a little bit here just to practice. And I started pretty low in the front, but I knew that when I tried it on, the lining sagged more in this side here than it did in the front. So what I'm doing is I'm pinning the lining to the 5/8 seam allowance, but in some spots, especially towards the back, I'm giving the lining a bigger seam allowance than the original 5/8 that I had marked, and I'll just pin that there. And essentially what's going to happen is that it is going to be higher at the center back than at the front edges. And I'm going to do that all the way around. And then I'm going to stitch it. And I think what's going to happen is I'm going to try it on once I've done the stitching and see if when it folds over, it hangs over the edge. I don't think it will, but it might. And then sort of try to adjust that as needed. But this is the good thing about doing it all by hand rather than bagging it, is that you have a lot more control. Oh, and another thing I wanted to point out, here you can see this ribbon, and the reason that I attached the ribbon is because, this one that I've already done, once you attach the lining doesn't go all the way down to the edge of the coat, the bottom edge. So if there was no ribbon there, you would see the raw edges of the wool. Now the wool wouldn't fray, but it doesn't look very pretty. So I just did that little bit of ribbon there, just basically for cosmetic reasons. The lining is completely attached to the hem. It does bag a little bit, which is fine. Everything matches. All the points here match. And so it's the next day. I let this hang on a door on a hanger overnight to see what would happen to it. And I did find that I had the lining too short. I had folded too much of it and made it a seam allowance, and it was causing the back of the coat to sort of bow in because the lining was pulling it up. So today I undid from about here to here, and I did it again with letting it out some. Here you can see, I guess, yeah, those little dots are my initial hem, and now it's all nice and pretty. The last thing to do on this cape coat is bind the armholes. So here, as you can see, there's no, it's still the raw edges. So that's the last thing to do. And I will do that by cutting bias strips of the lining fabric and then just sewing it to the right side all around the armhole, folding it in, sewing it again to keep it in place. But I'm not going to put that in this video because that is just pretty simple stuff that you can just look up just about anywhere. And that is the last thing before this coat is finished. And I am so excited. In the next video, I will put it on and show it to you all decked out in all its glory. So the last video will be essentially the modeling of the cape coat and also my thoughts, final thoughts on this whole project. And I hope that I can do it outside, at least the modeling bit, unless we are on lockdown. I am filming this on March 18th, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're not officially quarantined or on lockdown just yet, but that may just be the case. So for all of you watching in the future, that is what is going on right now. So with that said, thank you so much for watching. If you've made it through 6 videos of this cape coat, you are a star and you deserve to watch video number 7. I'll see you next time. Bye.